COO of the Kiva Center. And the people that talk to me regularly know that ever since I have made connections at the Kiva Center, I'm all in. I absolutely love their work, how they do it, the way they think about it. And it's been really exciting to engage with sort of really progressive thinking around mental health. It's kind of exactly what we need right now. I don't have to tell anybody here that mental health crisis is upon us already. We're already seeing so much evidence of people's unhealed trauma, their sort of emotional dysregulation playing out in public. And it's scary, it's worrying. And this is a really important conversation we need to have. It's past time that we really drill down on mental health and our mental health system. And so I'm very excited to have Vesper talk about psychiatric oppression. This is one of the topics that I am sort of sad to say I have, participated in psychiatric oppression by being employed in the system at many points in my life. Also have, personal experience with loved ones in the system. Sort of many people that work in the mental health system are in that boat. They come to it because they have struggled or their family members have struggled, and they care deeply about this work and about people impacted. But we have a system that at baseline expects you to accept being oppressed to get services and treatment in it. And that's something that I hadn't really seen that way before the pandemic. And it's really hard to think about and really painful. And at a time that so many of us, need help, want to give help, want to get help, need to build community. So I'm thrilled to have Vesper here today. They have no hesitation in going there to the sort of darker places that this topic can bring us. If you haven't already seen Vesper's website, they have so many media engagements, so many affiliations. Very recently, most notably, Vesper was invited to Washington, D.C. by the White House to witness the confirmation hearing. And that was a direct result of hardcore advocacy, and it's greatly appreciated. It's nice to see it was recognized at the top, at the national level. So you're a big time celebrity right here in Worcester, and we're really glad to have you here today. So yeah, thanks. It's great to see people like follow you on different media, and that is what brought them here today. We'll be able to share it out too, because I do think a lot of people really want to hear what you have to say about this. So I will zip it and turn it on over to you to lead us through.
Thank you for that excellent introduction, Amy. I am so appreciative. That's very kind. In terms of Worcester, Worcester has a lot of history in the United States as it relates to mental health. I don't know if a lot of you know, but there have been a lot of folks that in the early asylum reform movement were from Worcester, Mass. And we're one of the states that had one of the first state hospitals in the country, and
the very first. So there's a lot of rich history there. I want to preface with I am sick, so I am kind of chugging along here. So please approach with some compassion if I need to pause for a minute. But psychiatric oppression is a topic that a lot of folks feel uncomfortable talking about. And here is why. I mean, at the very start of when we talk about power and control as it relates to trauma,
We fear losing control of ourselves. We fear the potential of that. We fear disability, really, because of a larger culture of ableism that we are in. I'm going to introduce the terminology of saneism. I'm sure some of you have heard it before. A lot of you are probably more familiar with mental health stigma than you are saneism. And I'll explain why mental health stigma isn't going far enough. And I'd be amiss to say that, May is considered Mental Health Awareness Month. People have a lot of thoughts and feelings around Mental Health Awareness Month. The color green is symbolic of mood disorders and bipolar specifically. So some people feel that within itself is ableist because they don't want to be labeled with that. They don't want to presume or do not ascribe to a lot of those labels of those diagnoses because their diagnosis might have been a result of their own traumatic experience as it relates to oppression in their lives. They may feel that what they were ascribed by a psychiatrist, right, may have been because of a prejudiced system and the roots of that prejudiced system. So I'm going to be talking about psychiatric oppression, and I'm going to pull up the slides for you today. We'll start here. Okay. So the trauma of psychiatric oppression. I'm going to start with just some brief introductions before we actually delve into this fully. Just right here, here are our table of contents, really what I will be talking about today. First, we're going to start off with a content warning and introduction because there's a lot in terms of the history of psychiatric violence and psychiatric abuse. I'm also going to talk about disability rights as it relates to mental health. I'm going to also talk about trauma and more specifically, the mental health system. Then moving beyond this idea of mental health stigma and into one of psychiatric oppression, mental health prejudice, taking it a step further from stigma, because a lot of stigma campaigns have actually fed into a lot of oppressive things. As I was saying, with the color green being ascribed to mood disorders. I will say mental health awareness, that idea comes from Mental Health America, which is an organization that was founded by Clifford Beers, very well-known ex-patient, someone who founded the mental health hygiene movement, one of many different movements. And that the emergence of mental health awareness was never meant to further oppress people with mental health diagnoses, or at least that many who ascribed that intention and put that out there didn't intend for it to roll in that way. But then you have a lot of campaigns where a lot of nonprofits and for-profit organizations tokenize people with mental health diagnoses in order to gain more funding. And that is a serious issue. So we'll be talking about moving beyond the idea of mental health stigma and how can we appropriately represent the communities that are most impacted in the disability rights movement. And then we're going to talk about the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, a movement in its own right, has its own history. Survivor standing for psychiatric survivor. Some people identify it as ex-inmates and not ex-patients because they didn't feel like what they received was treatment in a lot of these facilities. And the final piece is we're going to talk about anti-oppression and trauma healing approaches, which will really get at to the root of some of the work that we do at Kiva Centers and other organizations do. So moving forward, I'm going to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to talk about the importance of moving beyond land acknowledgements too. So land acknowledgements, I want to acknowledge that the land upon which I gather has ancestral ties to the Nipmuc. But in that same vein, I want to acknowledge that the land that we gather on belongs to no one. We are born of it. We are part of a vast ecosystem. And that land acknowledgements are more about the conversation of the land, but also having intentional conversations about Indigenous cultures and Indigenous people, celebrating Indigenous people, not as something of the past, but something that is current. And Indigenous rights history and my history as a Taino person, as an Indigenous person of the Caribbean and of the United States, has so much to do with when we're talking about this idea of decolonizing mental health and a lot of the harmful diagnoses that have emerged from white supremacy, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. So I'm going to start with a quote from one of my elders, Lisolet Naniki Reyes Ocasio. She is a Taino elder, ceremonial leader, and board member for the Confederation of Taino People. And here she says, the same way they wrote us out of history, we will write ourselves back in. What a powerful act of reclamation to write yourself back into history. And I think today I'm going to share a little bit about not only disability rights history, but the rights and history of many different movements as it relates to psychiatric survivors and the psychiatric oppression. So starting with Kiva centers, about us at Kiva centers. Kiva is an Indigenous term from the natives of the Southwest, such as the Hopi and the Pueblo, that it really represents enlightenment through mutual support. We represent going deep within yourself and coming out healing yourself. So really think about Kiva as a metaphor for self-authorization and really autonomy over your own healing process, delving deep within yourself and coming out healing yourself. In that same vein, introducing the concept of Kiva with you all today is also moving the conversation beyond land acknowledgements, because I am sharing Indigenous wisdom with you all. The feather on our Kiva Center's logo is there because it represents a connection to the birds. It is a symbol signifying freedom in both the physical and spiritual sense, as well as ascension to a higher plane. Another piece of Kiva is that Kivas are physical formations of earth that are typically man-made by the Hopi or the Pueblo people. And in those spaces, you would sit typically in a hole underground, and you would sit there, concentrate, meditate, if you will, till you would reemerge, healing yourself in that way. At Kiva Centers, we believe that relationships with people who have undergone similar experience that are what is at the center that heals people, right? So sharing common experience, common humanity, common suffering, we can find healing in that together. And then from there, we really are trying to lead an effort around healing and freedom from the impacts of things like trauma, mental health, and substance use. More specifically, Kiva Centers as what is considered on this land, Massachusetts-based organization, is a peer-run technical assistance and peer support nonprofit. We work to transform policy and practice in communities and systems by integrating peer support at the center of that among people in all stages of life in different communities. So again, that is with mental health, substance use recovery, and healing from trauma. And something to note is Kiva is nationally recognized as a leader in trauma-informed community work. And our work has also spanned to different parts of the world. Kiva Centers has supported the creation and development of peer-run organizations across the United States and different parts of the world, countries such as Israel, Croatia, the Netherlands, and many others. So, our thought work there is really to bring a lot of the concepts of survivor-led, peer-run ideologies of communities reclaiming their power in instances of trauma. So I like to call this community care. So kind of, again, moving beyond the concept of self-care. I'm talking about moving beyond a lot of concepts, and I think that's important. Self-care, even though in a lot of regards is so important, that often self-care is ascribed to put the responsibility on the oppressed over every piece of their healing process or their recovery process. And even if you do identify with self-care, self-soothing, your own personal experiences, I think the idea of community care is really important, that we take care of each other, we support each other, we do more in community. And mutual aid is important in that. I mean, we've seen that throughout this pandemic and throughout many different stages in our own lives, that community care is important to the healing process. So the following training mentions and describes details of psychiatric abuse and violence. So please note, if you are activated at any point during this training, feel free to step out, feel free to take a moment and come back. And I understand that this is an uncomfortable topic. When a system is supposed to really help people and harm is caused, there is so much to that where it's like, wow, if I can't actually, again, surrender that control for a second and actually get some support when I feel at my highest in terms of distress, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Who can I trust? Who can I rely on? Especially when there's an organized system that has power over me. And I think that that's at the root of the discomfort, as well as what I was describing earlier, our fear of loss of control of ourselves, our fear of disability and being disabled, our fear of madness and experiences around madness, our fear of being put into a psychiatric facility. All of that is very important. And all of that interrelates to trauma, which can be both directly and indirectly felt. It is a ripple effect, if you will, throughout many of our communities. So, as I said, we're still moving beyond land acknowledgement. So I'd be amiss to not start with the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians, which was around 1893 to 1934. It was the first federal psychiatric institution for natives of the United States. And from across the U.S., it's 3 decades of operation. There were 400 individuals in that facility, and so many died and were not remembered by their community, known by their community. Here in the image above, you see a few dolls that were made by people who were inmates of the psychiatric institution, and I really clearly use the word inmate because of the fact that this federal institution was of the design to actually get Indigenous people away from their land. It was used as a tool of social control than it was as a tool of treatment. And something that was so harmful was the ascribing of different diagnoses based on the fact that there was a racial criminal ideology of natives, right? So a psychiatric diagnosis like horse stealing mania was considered a valid diagnosis at that time. Isn't that astonishing? The fact that a diagnosis like that would actually be considered valid. And you may be thinking throughout this presentation, as I present things of the past, you're like, well, Vesper, that's the past. That's not now. We're not experiencing these things now. And what I will say in response to that too is that psychiatric oppression is not only not a thing of the past, but these roots of oppression that remain largely unaddressed manifest and really do so much to inform our systems and where we are and where we are moving forward, right? So restraint and seclusion is something that continues to exist today, but yet the trauma and methodology of restraint and seclusion on different communities is often not addressed or spoken to. Even myself as an Indigenous person or other Indigenous people, the history of an institution like the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians is never spoken about, just like the boarding schools for Indigenous peoples have not been spoken about. So much trauma and so much history there that remains unacknowledged amongst our ancestors and our elders. So next here, we have a rebellion at Texas State Hospital. This was in 1955, and this was the Texas hospital for what was called at the time the Negro Insane. African-American inmates, Black inmates at large, rebelled and took over the hospital for 5 hours. This effort was led by a young adult, just 19 years old, Ben Riley. And they had a few demands at that time. What really led to this riot was the fact that prisoners of this facility, and again, I use prisoners very intentionally, were being beaten. If you think about it, 1955 isn't that long ago. And the methodology of, or not even methodology, but just the harm of beating folks, the fact that that was something that took place in just 1955 and remains unacknowledged is something that's very important. And then they also advocated for better counseling, organized exercise periods, such as fresh air, going out to jog, as well as the same rights as white inmates regarding meals, bathing, and freedom of movement. So not having your movement restricted in the same ways, having the same space. And as you can see in the newspaper article, it says mental patients riot over Jim Crow. And that was because Jim Crow was very much in effect in these facilities. And the thing is that tying it back to current day, that Black and brown folk in the United States are 4 to 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia or some type of psychosis than white patients. So when we're talking about people in this context and diagnosis in this context, there is something racially motivated there. And these numbers that I share with you come from NIMH. It was roughly that's the National Institute for Mental Health. It was roughly between 4 to 5 times more likely that Black and brown folk were diagnosed with schizophrenia more than white folk. But as you can see, a lot of these studies suggest that it was racially motivated. So that is just me tying something current here. You have something as overt, right, as beatings in a psychiatric institution, right? And then leading later on, you have something as subtle and covert, but still harmful and oppressive as readily diagnosing Black and brown people with schizophrenia and it being racially motivated. So further on the roots of oppression in psychiatry, I'm going to start with the father of American psychiatry. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I'll say that again, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So if you think at the very root of this nation's history, when you're talking about oppression and you're talking about a lot of these things, that the person who's considered the father of American psychiatry, a very important figure, someone whose portrait still hangs at the American Psychiatric Association today, he had ascribed this diagnosis, and this diagnosis, again, racially motivated, was, in quotes, as he would say, Negroes are suffering from an affliction called negritude. And then following, this disorder, in quotes, was thought to be a mild form of leprosy in which the only cure was to become white. Ironically, Rush was a leading mental health reformer and co-founder of the first anti-slavery society in America. So ironically, right? And there's so much there in terms of history and diagnosis of this idea of subservience, right? Spreading subservience onto white people, because there's this white supremacist idea of Black and brown folk being less than, that is being enforced by psychiatry and the oppression of psychiatry in our communities. Going further here, in 1851, prominent American physician Samuel Cartwright defined drapetomania as a treatable mental illness that caused Black slaves to flee captivity. He stated that the disorder was a consequence of slave masters who made themselves too familiar with the slaves, treating them as equals. Cartwright used the Bible as a support for his position, stating that slaves needed to be kept in a submissive state and treated like children to both prevent and cure them from running away. Again, prevent and cure them from running away. So you have this idea of, again, putting the responsibility back on the oppressed community and using psychiatry as a tool for validation of that. And again, keeping folk in a submissive state, but also this infantilization, right? Treating them like children. Infantilization is something that we see amongst people with mental health diagnoses often. And I think, something that is a part of that is really the roots of ableism and sanism, which I'll talk more about later on. So here we have hysteria, which was once considered a pervasive diagnosis, thought of as exclusively a female disease. Women's thoughts were considered a symptom of this disease that could be cured by either sex or sexual abstinence. So you have an objectification of the bodies of people who are assigned female at birth, right, through this idea of hysteria. You see a lot of this today with the readily diagnosis of things like bipolar and borderline amongst women today. Often there's similarities and ties there to a lot of those diagnoses and manifestations of what is often considered by psychiatrists complex trauma, to us maybe in general just trauma that exists with women because women are oppressed in a sexist society. And a transphobic society. And the thing here is that you have this idea of it's either through sex or sexual abstinence that this is done. So again, that is that specific control on women's bodies, as well as hysteria and all of its evolutions didn't come to an end really till 1980. Again, this isn't that long ago. And when I talk about different manifestations, it was labeled under many different names. And the fact that within itself, becomes an issue because of the fact that if we're still thinking of diagnoses like borderline and bipolar and hyperactive mood disorders and all of these other diagnoses that exist today, where are we addressing sexism potentially at the root of diagnosis? The issue of sexism in diagnosis, the issue of if it is a white male psychiatrist who is coming to this diagnosis and there is no second opinion at all, right? That is problematic in our society. And as early on, and at this point when hysteria was still called hysteria, pelvic massages, vibrators, and even physically hosing women down with water were considered forms of treatment. So again, a harm on someone's bodily autonomy, a form of control, being considered forms of treatment. And today, I think relating this to today, I want you to think about how often when someone is chemically restrained or physically restrained, could that situation that person was experiencing or what they were going through, what was happening to them, how it could have been handled differently had we just had a conversation, given a person space. And you may think that doesn't apply to every scenario, but how readily does a hierarchical, harmful system that we see in psychiatry and the mental health industrial complex come back to readily restrain someone? I want to just invite you to think about that. So the roots of oppression in psychiatry. Homosexuality was also considered, and categorized as several mental disorders for a period of time. It wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association removed the diagnosis of homosexuality from the second edition of its diagnostic and statistical manual. And conversion therapy was often used as a method of treatment, even until recently. Conversion therapy has been so popularized federally and used. And if you're not familiar with what conversion therapy is a therapy methodology, or what's called a therapy. I wouldn't even qualify it as a therapy, that is seeking to convert someone from being gay to straight. And I'm actually going to use gay and straight as terms very intentionally, because of the fact that gay is really a term that subverts and defies our idea of straightness. And straightness, the term straight actually comes from the term straight to the path of God, on the straight and narrow, as associated with heterosexuality. So by using those two terms, I'm tying a lot of the roots and the history behind those terms there. And conversion therapy, again, wasn't, and is very prominent in southern states, and is prominent even in states up in the north. I mean, a lot of conversion therapy practices happen, and they are unregulated. And even though, again, homosexuality has been considered a mental disorder since 1973. You also see it as prevalent with transphobia and happening in trans communities. That's important. And right here, we're going to be talking about the roots of oppression in psychiatry as it applies to trans and queer communities. Labels like transsexualism, gender identity disorder, transvestic fetishism, and transvestic disorder. Conversion therapy, again, also being used as a method of, in quotes, treatment for a lot of these communities. So the point of demonstrating a lot of these things is that psychiatry has historically been used as a tool to oppress people. And yet we don't talk about many of the ways in which psychiatry oppresses communities today. A lot of this history, a lot of these things as they interconnect to our society. And right here, I'm going to demonstrate and speak to a few things that we see today. So first thing I'm going to start off with is digital phenotyping. So if you're not familiar with what digital phenotyping is, digital phenotyping is what is being adapted, right, as a methodology right now to attempt to diagnose people based on their use of digital devices and how they use it. More particularly, for example, if you were to adjust the brightness settings on your phone, and that's signifying you were depressed through some type of app that monitors your phone use, or what you may be searching, really leading to this diagnosis. We're talking more about a digital age of surveillance that is leading to different forms of psychiatric oppression. And surveillance is something that's always been prevalent. People have been watched in psychiatric institutions and in the community, have had orders put on them, all sorts of things, often because of the perceived violence. And even if someone has done something violent, even if a person with a mental health diagnosis has done something violent, we don't often think about the systemic and social circumstances that lead to that violent action. And we're so ready to surveil and observe and restrain and seclude and do a lot of these harmful things. And yet we don't get to the root or the core of the issue. And as you can see, there's an image here of Abilify My Site. So this is a digestible tablet that has just gone onto the market through Abilify. And what it does is it actually monitors your medication intake, and it reports it to your physician. by physically being in your body. And this is just past FDA approval. So now you have a different form of surveillance that can further oppress folks, especially if they want to come off of their psychiatric medication. And there are some people who do. And you may be thinking, once again, why would someone want to do that if they have a mental health diagnosis and it's supporting their treatment and it's doing a variety of things? There are many people who have a lot of negative side effects from medications. And there's a lot of medications that are available in the United States that are actually deemed archaic in different countries, such as Thorazine and Haldol, and lithium, and many, many, many others that we still see available in the States today. And something that I think that's so important is do we truly live in a culture of informed consent if we're not told how we can get off of some of these psychiatric medications, especially when we have negative side effects? And is it truly informed consent if we're not hearing about those side effects at first? Also, when medication is so heavily marketed, like in the United States, and it's illegal in Europe to market medications via commercial campaign or via a lot of the ads that we see on social media. So you have this really mingling of private corporation with pharmaceutical industry that really largely feeds into a harmful system that's at play when we talk about this. And information technology is a huge piece, but we could also look at some of the things that we talk about today. For example, there's an image here of a room at a psychiatric hospital. Now, I will say this was early 2000s, right? And people have attempted to make a lot of improvements to psychiatric facilities. But I would argue, even if you enter a facility voluntarily, and you can't leave, is it truly voluntary? I think we need to question our idea of voluntary and involuntary as it translates to mental health and disability rights more largely. And we need to have more outward conversations around psychiatric oppression. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, have been outwardly talking about psychiatric oppression for over a decade, nearly 2 decades now, talking about psychiatric violence as a serious issue in many different countries. Yet we live in a very privatized guise here in the United States because, again, we have that intermingling of private corporation and policy more often than not. To whose benefit is it if we're not talking about psychiatric oppression and the power that really comes from convincing someone that they are a danger to themselves and others when in fact they could have probably used a trauma healing response? I'm going to take a moment to open the floor to some initial questions, thoughts, things you want to unpack. And then I'd like to talk more about what can we do tangibly. Feel free to raise your virtual hand.
I think you need a minute. That is some pretty heavy stuff for sure. And, being in this field for more than 30 years, teaching this stuff, I learned some things. And of course, I think it's intentional that we don't share this information or frame it this way. And we know the women's movement in particular, the psychiatric oppression was used to shut down all of the leaders of that movement. They were hospitalized. We can just label you mentally ill, and then all of a sudden, whatever you have to say isn't valid anymore. And that's really a powerful weapon of oppression.
Yeah, and more specifically, things like non-compliant, right? We hear that terminology a lot. You're being non-compliant when you may be advocating for yourself. Then there's diagnoses like anosognosia, which what that diagnosis is, and it's still treated as a valid diagnosis in the DSM-5. is someone being resistant to treatment or resisting treatment. And the fact that on the American Psychiatric Association's website, if you have a chance later today, you can go on their website and you'll notice that you can suggest new classifications to the DSM. Any person can suggest a new classification to the DSM. There's a box that's actually it's like a search box. You type in and then you can send. And I think that really challenges at the crux of this, what is really the science for this, right? A lot of people have been saying have the biomarkers for what is called mental illness in our society, right, been found? And the thing is that they have not been. For the majority of diagnoses, there have been environmental factors, minimal genetic factors, right? So you do have some of those at play, right? But largely it is environmental. It is what is happening to us that leads to a lot of these diagnoses. So if oppression is at play, right? If you are experiencing a form of oppression, to ascribe a psychiatric diagnosis then to that form of oppression, it's really challenging. It's really challenging. I see, Mary, you have your hand up.
Hi, I'm Mary. So I really like the idea of being able to not take meds and all that. But it took a long time to find something where I'm not suicidal all the time, and I'm scared of going back to that.
Yeah. And I do want to say that when I speak to treatments and medications and the harm of those things, it's really so people can be informed of the potential of that. That's not to say that medication doesn't work for you. I think our society has to come to terms with psychiatric medications can be both life-saving and life-destroying at the same time. And those are two complex truths to hold at the same time, like that. And that simply is what it is. But the information needs to be there. We need to have an actual culture of informed consent. I'm going to go to Sibiohan. I'm not sure if I pronounced your name correctly. So.
Hello, yeah, it's Siobhan, so it's an Irish name. Hello, thanks today for doing the conference. I'm speaking from London. One of the things I just wanted to add to this discussion, really sort of the way in which all the different sort of groups you've discussed, the interlinking with the maintenance of inequality in society, and the way in which these sort of psychiatric systems justify or minimize or exclude the possibility of inequality as a fundamental underpinning. So people's responses to inequality, whether it's through racialized groups, sexualized groups, and then so on, is then sort of deemed as some sort of disorder or pathology. And that just seems to be coming up for me quite a lot. There's a book called The Spirit Level, and I think there are two English epidemiologists, I said that word right, and they looked at the correlation between mental health problems, imprisonment, early teenage pregnancies, and drug addiction, a variety of things, depending on how unequal the countries were. And USA and UK came out on the worst markers. And you could see differences from when you had the sort of high taxation as well. So that's one thing. But they also talked about, well, this is, they're looking at it in a very sort of monetary thing. But then you've got all those other, personal ways of being in the world, which feed into that inferior superior type of way, and when that rubs up against the structures of power systems, we pathologize it. I hope I sort of gone a bit woolly towards the end, but I thought I'd just add that bit, if that's just another what I've been thinking about, because the whole sort of the maintenance of inequality and the psychiatric system. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you highlighting the UK. So, like, for example, in the UK, there's a great network. It's called A Disorder for Everyone. And I do a lot of work with the folks at A Disorder for Everyone, and they have this international festival every year that's called A Disorder for Everyone Festival, and it really emerges from this book that they have called "Drop the Disorder: Challenging the Culture of Psychiatric Diagnosis." And I actually wrote a chapter for their second book, which is "Drop the Disorder: Doing Something About It, Activism," and I talk about the history of psychiatric oppression as it relates to an individual person, Malcolm X's mother, Lois Langdon, who was incarcerated in Kalamazoo State Hospital for 13 years of her life. She came out when she was 93 years old, and she had 8 children, and she was being surveilled by white social workers through the welfare system, and she was afraid of losing her kids, and she was constantly on edge, and eventually she's brought to the hospital and she's kept there. But what people don't know is that her husband was run over by a car, right? But they believe it was racially motivated in the way that it was always speculated that it was by a white supremacist group, Black Mass, who did it to him. His name was Earl. And basically how intergenerational trauma, right, interrelates with surveillance. Because if you know anything about Malcolm X, he was surveilled by the FBI up until the point that he died. So there's a historical relation. And again, a silence amongst liberation movements, right? Using mental health as a reason for that. So at the crux of social control, we're talking about psychiatry. So more particularly in the United Kingdom, there's that great network, the Drop the Disorder, A Disorder for Everyone network in that book. And I think something that's so important as well is that there's differentiation, but just like here, there's a lot in terms of private corporation and advertisement and a lot of those things that interrelate, right, in those countries. So it's so important, so critical. I'm going to go to Liz because I see, Liz, you have your hand up.
Hi, Vesper. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for all of this. What I wanted to ask you about, and what I really have a problem with, is we are so frankly discussing that this is abuse, this is violence, this is incarceration, but the people who work in these systems, I would argue, seem really brainwashed. They call this care, and we call it personality changing trauma. I have this unique perspective where in my day job, I have to interface a lot with a healthcare workers union, and they feel really strongly that their state mental health facilities provide care and provide treatment and are places where people recover. And I can't make sense of that intellectual gap between the violence that happens in these facilities and people thinking that they're helping. So I wondered if you had insight on that.
Yeah. And I think, getting back to that, as I was saying that, and I was going to talk about, we really have to get to the root of more widely discussing ableism and saneism in different spaces. And I mean saneism as in oppression and prejudice on the basis of being someone who experiences distress in a way that moves against the conventions of our society, right? Someone who might identify in many different ways, whether if that be as mentally ill or a person with a mental health diagnosis or a trauma survivor or neurodivergent or mad or disabled largely, right? That everyone who has those different experiences, whether if you're someone who has been diagnosed, not diagnosed, you've experienced emotional distress in some way, that the pathology, right, the categorization of human experience is problematic, and it takes place in a hierarchical system, right? And we need to look more broadly at what policing is, right? And when I say policing, I don't mean it only in the context of law enforcement. I mean it in social workers, mental health providers, anyone in a position of power can police. That is just the truth of the matter. And, does that mean that we're in a society where we can readily dismantle all of these institutions tomorrow and it'll be okay? No, there will be a lot of unhoused people who will struggle, of course, but there can be better alternatives that we're building. There are a lot of empty houses. There are a lot of empty places. There are a lot of policies that we can do. It's just not cost effective. It's not cost effective to leave psychiatric institutions empty because you bill per individual who is in there. You bill per individual you serve. So, yeah, and that's the unfortunate truth. I think we need to build social awareness, right, about a lot of these topics. We need to talk more about it. We need to talk about why is disability rights different when we talk about the mental patient, when we talk about the person who's having these experiences. All of a sudden it turns to, well, they're violent. Well, they don't know what's good for themselves. Oh my God. Like it enters a space of we can remove control before they harm themselves or someone else. And truth be told, do people who experience emotional distress harm people or themselves? Yes. Do we actually have to figure out how to sit with danger and actually have conversations in danger and actually navigate and self-examine our liability and risk culture? Yes. Hold multiple truths at the same time. Just as I was telling you earlier, medication can be life-saving and life-harming, and life-destroying at the same time. That's the truth here too. There's so much to this. There's so much complexity in self-examination, because if we actually examine a lot of these things, we will be examining tools that have historically been used as methods of social control. We will be examining private industries that make a lot off of medication. We will be examining institutions that have been utilized for purposes of keeping marginalized communities further oppressed. We'll be examining so much. There's so much trauma to unpack here. There's a quote by an activist. Her name is Bonnie Burstow, and she says, "Psychiatrists have a king-like power. They can talk to any person in any society, and they can deem them mentally ill and have them put away." Right. And regardless of your state of emotional distress, what you're experiencing, that person can make that decision. It's not regulated in the same way. There aren't other efforts at play. So I see other hands. I hope that answered your question. I'll go on a tangent about a lot of these things. So Gordon.
Yes, a friend of mine was involuntarily committed, and she called me for help, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call, who to refer to, or anything. Eventually she was released. Can you help me with what to do in such a situation?
It's a good question. Who to recommend someone to and what to do. I'm going to recommend a few different resources. I mean, one in Massachusetts, in Worcester, the Kiva Centers, where I am representing, where I am coming from, is a peer-run organization. We have a 24/7 crisis alternative to hospitalization that's called a peer respite. It's called Karaya Peer Respite. And is a great resource for a lot of folks. But the truth is that we don't have enough things like peer respites. We don't have enough alternatives and approaches to the traditional service system that we see. However, in a lot of these spaces, even if it's another space where harm may be caused, there's a lot of people working in these systems and these spaces seeking to to create change, seeking to do that work. And sometimes it's connecting to those individuals as well. I highly recommend that that wherever you are, wherever you may live, wherever you hail from, you can take a moment to actually work with folks and build networks around different resources that are non-coercive and non-carceral. Right. And I mean non-carceral in the sense of they're not punishment minded, right? The mentality of we have to put that person away. We have to address that. We have to take care of them, right? As if they're a problem to be taken care of. And that is something that so heavily exists in the mental health system. I recommend educating ourselves as well as others about the different resources that are actually willing to outwardly speak to that, or focus on things like trauma healing or peer run support or different things like that. I don't think that there is like one answer for what is the right resource in every space, right? But I can say this, that communities come together, and I always think that it can be important to look at the resources that are available in your area. And if there are not resources that are focusing on things like disability rights, patients' rights, peer support, all of these different components, right, then it would be like an opportunity to potentially establish that. Again, that doesn't have to be on you. You don't have to do that. But I do recommend disability rights organizations. I do recommend, if you ever run into an issue after recommending someone and they have a human rights violation, a mental health law center, a disability law center, many different resources like that. I know the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law is a national organization that can connect you to another mental health law center. I have a great relationship with them. And yeah, that's in terms of recommendation, I recommend community-driven resources as much as possible. And if not, I would examine the website. I'd have a conversation with folks ahead of time. And the thing is, one of the challenges is we don't have time. When someone's experiencing emotional distress, you want to like help immediately. But like, it's also important to examine, like, am I helping to the point where I am taking away someone's autonomy too? Do I feel they are incapable of doing something for themselves because of the distress they experience and their diagnosis or anything else to that nature? So self-examination is important as well. But I definitely do want to say, just in terms of supporting folks, mutual aid networks, building networks where we know individuals and organizations that do, again, non-coercive, non-carceral support work is highly important. Thanks, Gordon. That was a great question. So important. Lois?
Hello, how are you? I just wanted to know if you could just touch a little bit more. Here, let me just put the camera on. Just touch a little bit more on policing. I think that is so important. And it's such when you call them, and the response that you get sometimes from them. I have a son that suffers from mental illness. And when I've called the police, them standing there and laughing like if it's funny, they see what you're going through. And it seems like they have no compassion. So if you could just touch a little bit more on policing.
Absolutely. I think one, what I was mentioning earlier in terms of like what is a carceral approach, being very punishment minded, the institution of law enforcement specifically has been to do just that, enforce these laws, right? Enforce these ideas, enforce this. But when those laws have been designed by institutions built on systemic oppression and so many various things, right? And they're not self-examined, what ends up happening is that you have police enforcing laws that are harmful to the public, as well as the people who are often in the positions of becoming police officers, and just the profession and the idea of it itself, right? And I know that controversial topic when we talk about defunding police or policing or anything along those lines, but I'd say specifically as it relates to mental health, having a person who is supposed to respond to instances of violence, to many different things, when someone is experiencing emotional distress, causes further harm. And more often than not, police are put in for these mental wellness checks, right? And are often put into these circumstances where they're asking a line of questioning to someone who might be experiencing a really, really, really hard time. I do want to acknowledge that, since this conversation is through Worcester Addresses Childhood Trauma, and we're talking about trauma in many different contexts, that in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, where I am currently, we do have a crisis intervention team as police who are out of uniform coming into these spaces. I think one of the problems that we continue to see is that is not enough for many of these circumstances, because we're lacking the component of personal experience, context, how it relates, how to respond. Who better to respond to a situation, right, than a person who was impacted by a similar experience? Now, you may ask yourself, that's a difficult scenario. How would someone like a peer supporter respond to every police call or all of these police calls around mental health? And situationally, as I think things exist right now, you wouldn't have a peer supporter respond to every single call, but you would have a community-driven approach with many different layers, right? So as we seek to rebuild in community, we have peer supporters, social workers who are really informed about a lot of these things, police who are really informed about a lot of these things, and people responding to different scenarios. And what will happen eventually as people seek to self-examine, as they learn, as they do a lot of this work, we can work towards a society where we don't need policing in the same way. There have been societies that have existed before without policing in the same way. The question is really, can we exist as a society without policing today in the current culture we live in, the current climate we live in a lot of the contexts that we live in? And I argue that we can. I don't think it's around the corner, but I think we can get there, right? And we do need to talk about prison abolition in every context. We have to talk about psychiatric abolition. When I'm talking about abolition, again, I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about dismantling all of these systems tomorrow. I'm talking about building and working towards a society through a discipline of hope, right? Having that discipline of hope that we can imagine a better society where our communities are working collectively together to respond to a lot of these situations. For example, restorative justice is an indigenous ideology of when harm has been caused, when something has been done, that two or multiple people can sit in the same space with someone who is supporting that conversation, and they can really process it together. And there are organizations who are doing this, right? There was one circumstance where there was two Black men, and one of the men thought that the other man, had attacked his brother, right? And I believe this had happened in New York. And something that was so prevalent about the situation was that the man who he thought had attacked his brother, he had the wrong person, but he didn't know he had the wrong person. So he planned, okay, I know this guy goes to this corner store or was around that corner store. I'm going to come there the next day. I'm going to come there with a few of my buddies, and we're going to show him, not to treat us this way, not to treat my brother this way. So he comes in with a few people he knows, and he attacks this person, and this person fights back, and it's this whole situation. And one of them was stabbed, and it was really, really difficult, heart-wrenching, horrible situation where communities are attacking each other, right? Who are oppressed, who don't trust authority for many valid reasons. And there was a restorative justice organization who basically, when they were in court, just, going over these things, and one of them, actually both of them were facing serious prison time. The alternative was recommended. Why don't we have a moderated conversation where we can talk through the situation, talk through the context, and it'd be multiple moderated conversations. Long story short, the conversation kind of went like, well, you attacked my brother. And he was like, I didn't do that. And he's like, I don't believe you. And then it went from like, I don't believe you to really having more and more conversations. And then throughout these conversations, they realized we're a part of the same community. We both don't trust authority. We both have had all of these traumas and forms of oppression at play. We both had all of these things. And they actually came out of the conversation, viewing each other as brothers, and they became closer. And that organization that had facilitated that conversation was able to actually have there be no prison sentence if they were able to come to a resolution, and they did. So I think that there can be more efforts like that, more restorative justice efforts as a response, especially when we're thinking of policing. And it has to be fully informed and led by people who are impacted by policing. Otherwise, you will overlook building these responses. I hope that answered your question. I think I went on a whole other tangent, another story. You have any questions, folks? Maybe we could highlight some things in the chat if there's anything that's come up so far.
I think there was, a lot of what people had in the chat, they did express in just now. So much big stuff, really. It can be very overwhelming to just think about how much harm this is doing and the multiple levels that we're harming people when we say we're trying to help them. Just that in and of itself is messed up, right? Like, if you think about here, we're trying to help you, and you really are left wondering how helpful it is when people often have more. I have heard many people say that just what they experienced within the mental health system was more harmful and damaging than whatever led them to be in the mental health system in the first place. And there's sometimes people have good outcomes, but that is not the norm. Mm-hmm. Our system is not getting good outcomes at baseline. It's really the exception. And that's so troubling, and especially given the moment in time we're in right now, when so many people need community and healing, and labeling them and isolating them and locking them up and policing them is the absolute last thing that we need right now.
Yeah. And it's a very, very prevalent issue. I think now even more so than it was before the pandemic, because there's so many people who might be expressing a struggle, right, with emotional distress, their mental health for the first time in their lives. And actually, a lot of people who have a good idea, understand how to navigate seclusion and isolation in the ways that they have, are people who have actually already been through seclusion and isolation. So we see that in a lot of our peer support groups and a lot of our spaces. We're supporting people how to navigate that feeling, and that's been something throughout the pandemic, but also how to navigate a lot of the other things at play, right? There's such a shortage, right, in terms of food, money, needs, like things that aren't being met. And actually, it's not a shortage. That's the wrong term for it. It's really the fact that we aren't giving people these resources, right? We aren't giving people these resources. I mean, a lot of folks say, what could be a resolution to the housing crisis? And it's actually giving people housing. People don't like that answer, but there are so many, and I'll emphasize this, so many empty buildings, so many empty homes, so many spaces that could be utilized otherwise. And I think about that in the context of emotional and distress and mental health is really some of the things to address a lot of those things. Like, for example, at Kiva, we sponsor a lot of the community fridges in the city of Worcester and outside of the city of Worcester. And that initiative has been important because it's 24/7 access to food that is led by community, driven by community, supplied by community. And honestly, sometimes just being like, oh, I don't have to worry about food, like improves the situation so much more. So think about environmental factors, think about systemic factors at play whenever you're talking about mental health. And again, I invite more people to engage in conversations around psychiatric oppression. Talk about it. Talk about freedom to identify with our experiences as we will. Talk about the context of disability rights as it applies to people with mental health diagnoses, because we have a society that is immediate to jump to those people are violent, we need to do away with them. I mean, since the beginning of history, you have madhouses, which were in towers that put people far away, right? You have psychiatric institutions that are on the outskirts of town. Now you have people who are intentionally isolated from society, right? You had I couldn't pronounce the name. I think it's the Northenberg, which was a ship that went from town to town in Europe and picked up mad people or people with mental health diagnoses and put them on the ship and took them to different towns so they could no longer have to deal with their problem of people who experience emotional distress, right? So they wouldn't have to self-examine, right? If you can keep us out of sight, if you can keep us isolated, submissive, keep us away, whether if you have that thought in the forefront of your mind or it is deep in your subconscious, it is there, right? There is an inherent fear of, I do not want to end up like that. I don't want my child to end up like that. I don't want my family members to end up like that. And honestly, we should re-examine that and be like, end up like what? Like, what are some of the circumstances that lead there? And not only that, but I invite you to think about it in many different contexts, right? If someone's hearing voices, seeing visions, having different things, there are many indigenous societies that actually revered those voices and those visions as a message, right? As something to work with, as something to explore. Our society has changed that idea, right? The Degara of what is now known as South Africa, they would have their elders guide young adults through a vision quest, right? Through their experience, what they were experiencing, what they were going through. That is peer support. We have formalized it in some type of way in our traditional service systems, right? And peer support exists in many different spaces. It exists in our barber shops. It exists in our salons. It exists in our community centers. It exists in our churches. It exists in many different spaces. People gain that support. It's not considered evidence-based, even though peer support's been evidence-based since 2007, but it is a community-led response of, hey, I've been through something similar. Let me go along with you in this journey and really talk this through without any judgment, right? Or if I do have judgments, I bring those to the table and I talk about them transparently. There's so much to that, so much important in terms of trauma healing responses that we could be more closely examining, thinking about, utilizing, and intentionally having in our communities. I want to open the floor to more questions, comments.
Well, since we have the time, somebody had said in the comments, and it is a big issue, I think. What about all the people that are colluding with this system by sort of being employed in it? And, I can certainly speak from, I have been employed in these systems. And, I think that there's not the questioning of pretty much we don't question much in our culture. We really go along with the program pretty well until, we don't. and there's not a lot of support for not going along with the program. And I think that the system, some of these care systems are pretty oppressive and hierarchical and really disempowering. It's sort of one of the stories I like to tell about the consequences of not ever consulting impacted people when you make a policy or decision, right? I worked at a school where they used timeout rooms. They used seclusion rooms. You would put kids in it was like a closet-sized room, and it had nothing in it. The walls literally were padded. There was a camera so you could see what was happening inside, just making sure. And when somebody was really, really out of control, we would use that timeout room. We would have them in there until they could calm down. Groups organized around that. They were like, that is so cruel. How can you be doing that? That's terrible. It was not ideal. But so they banned it. They're like, no more timeout rooms. But there wasn't any other things suggested. So we ended up doing far more physical restraints than ever before. So, and I have to say, and maybe this is news to people, I doubt it is, 100% of the kids in that treatment center had a sexual abuse history. 100%. So we're taking, instead of here you are, calm down in this room by yourself, we're having people on top of you, holding you down until you submit and are calm. And the twistedness of that wasn't lost on me. And like, wow, that's what we're doing. I guess I just say that to say, like, this is not, people within the system are not, don't have an organized advocacy agenda. People don't know about what's happening. People aren't well informed. And I'm just hopeful that conversations like this really help people outside of this field understand what the oppression that is going on. Mm-hmm. And, it's not lost on me either that women, in the women's movement, women activists were hospitalized to shut them down. And turns out, same thing with racial justice movements. People use the psychiatric system to shut people down, get them invalidated, discredited, and it's gone pretty unquestioned, sad to say.
Yeah, and I'd be amiss to say that it doesn't just exist in our psychiatric system, which I often refer to as the mental health industrial complex, because it more largely encompasses so many different things beyond psychiatry. It's in our education system, it's in our criminal justice systems, it's in many different spaces. And I think it really gets to if you have a chance to think about decarceration and non-carceral approaches, think about self-examine your own approaches to things. Are you more readily to jump to punish someone? If you're in a position of power, like, would you restrain someone? Would you do something like this? If you have those experiences, like that's important to self-examine. Like why do I do this to people? Why do I have a desire to do that to someone? Why would we do this? And more often than not, you'll find in that answer that when it's like, well, I wanted it to stop. I didn't want them to harm themselves. I didn't want them to harm someone else. I was afraid. I did this. It gets at the crux of when we're talking about prejudgment, prejudice, a lot of these things. And again, saying let's step away from mental health stigma and take it a step further. It's a weaponized prejudgment. Prejudgment is a natural survival mechanism. I love saying this. Prejudgment is a natural survival mechanism. When it is weaponized, it then becomes prejudice. A society must be deeply traumatized in order to turn a survival mechanism against itself. Let's examine that trauma. Where does that come from? I see BNA and then Liz have their hands up.
Hi, Vesper. In just what Amy and you were just sharing, I think of the Stanford prisoner experiment, right? Giving people power, even when as peers we are hired by an agency, there's still that power, right? So that power dynamic that, then you use force, addressing that. I really like the name of this, with it being a focus on trauma. Because when I spoke for a presentation, I gave the analogy of how traumatic it can be to be restrained to equally how you get treated in a jail cell. The exact same way. Well, equating that to that, and immediately people's reactions were completely different. They became less guarded and less defensive and brought up emotion, because you're not thinking of the trauma that it's causing you to be restrained. Or maybe I was restrained during my traumatic event. This is building even more on top of that trauma. And this is why I'm responding this way, right? So yeah, that came to my mind. And thank you for this wonderful session.
Thank you, BNA. And I do want to emphasize that, again, when I was talking about the United Nations and the World Health Organization, they examine things like restraint and seclusion as a human rights violation. And it's recognized, again, on an international level, but it is not recognized in the United States. It's because of private corporation and industry, and the fact that the United States has such an I'm going to say invisible empire, even though it's not very invisible, that there's not a lot of questioning or challenging of a lot of private industries in the United States, and the United States in particular. And when I refer to invisible empire, I mean entities like McDonald's existing in Japan and in Europe. And I mean territories surrounding the United States that we don't talk about as colonies, or really talk about the root of colonization and histories of colonization there, right? We don't talk about a lot of those things. The fact that military bases are considered United States soil wherever they are in the world, right? So that's a pretty intense empire, if you will. That's a whole other conversation. But that's when we talk about international entities, even trying to regulate countries that do some of these harms. When we have those conversations, that's some of the challenges that we face, right? Is talking about private corporation intermingling with public institutions. So Liz, yes.
Yeah, this is really getting into the belly of the beast here. But I think something that I really struggle with on this issue, and frankly, I have personal experience here, is that the staff don't seem to have any tools to de-escalate tense situations without resorting to violence. And I would go as far as to argue that they enjoy it. There's nothing scarier than seeing nurses talk and brag on Instagram about the things they do at work and how powerful they feel. And there's even a really disturbing passage in Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, where he discusses his personal experience with medical violence. And there's a passage I was puzzled by the pleasure I felt while restraining patients. And it's this guy is considered the patriarch of modern trauma recovery. And yet he's openly speaking about how this brought him pleasure. So I wonder, Vesper, whether you had thoughts on why don't they have other tools for de-escalation? You had said a quote before that I started to write down, a society must be deeply traumatized to weaponize a trauma response. And I think that's what you said. And I feel the two are very much intertwined there.
Yeah, they are intertwined. And I really appreciate you bringing that to light. And I think there is a truth to that, beyond the fear that I was talking about earlier, there is something else at play where people are sometimes, whether if they recognize it or not, they are enjoying the position of power they are in. And sometimes it can come from a reclamation of control from your own experiences around trauma that you have yet to self-examine. And again, that's when we get into infantilizing too, because you have control over, the people you're working with, whether if you recognize it or not, and you can abuse that power, right? And more often than not, there's such a difficult human rights process to even be able to report a lot of these complaints. You're often reporting to the Disabled Persons Protections Commission, which is said it's said to be that in the state of Massachusetts, probably under a different name in different spaces, and then DCF in Massachusetts, which might be actually referred to as Child Protective Services in other states. So. And it's a rigorous process to report all those human rights violations. And some people know that. They might know that subconsciously. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to talk to this person and I'm going to make whatever interaction might be stop, right? Or I might, I might be really angry and this person is just so annoying, or I don't want to deal with this today. And that can sometimes escalate to violence because you are put in a position where you are, again, carcerally minded to shut a situation down and control it in a self-contained environment. So you see that a lot, and there's not enough examination about that. And I think again, I'm going to kind of reference what B&A was talking about earlier, the Stanford prison experiment. We have not done more studies around that or really talked about, why people do this. And it's so true in the psychiatric institution, regardless of how lovely the environment is. It doesn't matter if you have all of the colored walls and the lively art and plants and an open environment where you can see everything. If people have this carceral mentality in the space, I see so many hospitals that operate kind of like the panopticon. Have you all ever heard of the panopticon? So you're being surveilled, you're being watched, regardless of wherever you are. I've seen enclosed courtyards, right, that have this idea of freedom that isn't actually there, or libraries where books are censored, right? Entire pages are removed. There's a control of the culture and the space that you're in every context, not only in the environment, but in the employees of that facility. All right, Kaylee.
Hi guys, sorry, I don't have my camera on because I'm looking like a hot mess. So I save you from it. This got me thinking. So I've kind of been on both sides. I've worked in inpatient, and I'm actually just graduating with my degree in social work. And honestly, this is stuff I think about so much. And it has, I'm happy I did the degree, and I'm excited to be in the field. But with that being said, I'm also horrified of many elements of my education. And I felt like in so many classes, I would be the only one like talking about this stuff when people very, formally, quote unquote, formally educated, and that's kind of where it comes from, would have no idea, about any of this stuff. So I'm definitely going to be sending this to, I think it's recorded, but to some professors to circulate. But it got me thinking too, just in inpatient, it kind of mirrors the tolerance for violence that capitalism has. Like in our society, we have our tolerance for violence in every form is just like out of this world. Like when I worked in inpatient, I would be sick. If I saw a restraint, I would be sick, like physically sick. And I would try to talk to people about it, nurses especially, who are, burnt out and maybe they, need to use humor as a coping skill or whatever it may be, trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. They would kind of just roll it off and laugh and say, oh, we'll give them the cocktail or whatever that like very crass humor was. And I would feel sick. And it's amazing the just the astronomical like tolerance for all of these, and it's the tolerance for violence, but not any tolerance for like self-determination or humanizing people. Like we couldn't give our patients like I would give people whatever if they needed a sweatshirt. Yeah, I'm going to go home and I have sweatshirts. I'm going to give, and I was so looked down upon that I was like, what? You can't give someone a freaking sweatshirt? Are you kidding me? This is a human, like this, or a pair of like undies that aren't those like nasty, like netted ones. I'm like, no, this is not Okay. So anyways, I'm rambling, but I think there's just a lot to be said about that. And I still have, I've been, treated myself for mental health issues, and I've been in an inpatient role and now coming into this role. So there's a lot of kind of divergences that are meeting, and it's there's just a lot to unlearn and learn. And I'm just very thankful for this. So thank you.
That is great. If there's any takeaway from this conversation, is really that service providers, whoever might be working in this role, can actually do this type of work. There's a kind of a group of abolitionist social workers, and I think it's abolitionist social work really speaking to a lot of this work, because even though social work has a history of harm, social work also has a history of activism. It has both, which is a very complicated history and a very, very complicated piece. And I do want to say that I really recommend the works of Michel Foucault. If you have a chance, Discipline and Punishment, The Birth of the Prison. He also has another one that's called The Birth of the Clinic, as well as Madness and Civilization, that really talks about the history of how mad people have been treated. And I use that term very specifically, mad people, because mad was used as a term of criminalization of people with mental health diagnoses. It's reclaimed very much in the way that we reclaim the term queer. It's meant to subvert and defy our understanding of emotional distress and mental health. And we don't talk about freedom on the basis of identity with our mental health diagnosis or our experiences of emotional distress. We just talk about, the fact that services need to be met. This needs to be here. This needs to be there, right? Or it needs to be treated. We need to do something about it. We need to fix this. It's a fix mentality, and it's so important to address. Is really the carceral mind once again. I think another challenging piece, which I will say aloud because it's being recorded, and you might share this with other folks, is that there is a history of anti-psychiatry, right? But the basis of some folks in that history, for example, particularly the Church of Scientology, has been, very, very vehemently anti-psychiatry, has had organizations for anti-psychiatry, but for the wrong reasons, really, because of their founder, L. Ron Hubbard. He had some ideas around something called dialectics or Dianetics that he tried to propose to the American Psychiatric Association that got declined. So there was a level of resentment in a lot of the doctrinations that he wrote. And a lot of Scientologists speak outright to a lot of these concepts and the way that they're valid, but then they're trying to indoctrinate people to a cult, which is problematic. So sometimes people talk about psychiatric abolition and anti-psychiatry and some of these histories, and then they immediately jump to Scientology. They immediately jump to that because of the fact that it's been used as a form of abuse. So it further invalidates it. And then because psychiatry is treated as all forms of psychiatric treatment and ideology, and these histories are, often blindly thought of as valid science. We reach this problem of, as soon as you challenge it, it's inherently unscientific, which simply isn't true. There's so much in terms of human rights abuses and so much pseudoscience that I just presented to all of you that has existed and continues to exist. And we don't challenge it as a society at all. All right. So I do recognize it is 1:35. We still have some time. I actually left a lot more space for discussion because I was anticipating a lot of people talking about, well, what do you do when a patient's non-compliant? What do you do here? And I mean, you have to keep in mind, I've been speaking to a lot of these things for close to a decade now, over a decade. So it's there have been a lot of evolutions in terms of conversation throughout that time. So I I would invite y'all to take a look at these different resources. I recommend the book On Our Own by Judy Chamberlain. Judy Chamberlain was an activist from the consumer survivor ex-patient movement, ex-inmate movement. I like to call it the psychiatric survivor movement, or MAD movement internationally, because some folks in Europe refer to it as Mad Pride, and Mad Pride has had its own histories around reclaiming Mad identity. And all of it really ties into disability rights and the social model of disability. And what I mean by the social model of disability is that there isn't something inherently wrong with your body or mind as you are, right? But rather the society that we live in is not accessible to you, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with us. This is when we get into the social model of trauma, right? And these are really the intersections of the social model of trauma and social model of disability, where at the root, a society is not accessible enough. And I argue that when we default to mental illness, when we default to a lot of these things, we're not being accessible enough. We're not really challenging these ideas enough, because the thing is that you're putting the onus, the responsibility to recover back onto the person. You're not putting the responsibility on the system to be accessible. So that's when we really get into challenging that concept around recovery at times, because that within itself, just as rehabilitation, has been used as a tool to oppress people.
I was just going to type it in the chat, but I guess I'll say it since, we have time. When I saw you talked about the service warriors, I think that's empowering people for inclusive communities. It has a disability rights youth group, and they do service, meaning they do community service with the intention of flipping the script from people with disabilities need help to people with disabilities give help. And they actually did a early on trauma training on trauma of disability. And one of the things that I think is relevant here is just when you're talking about sexism or racism, there's a definable homogeneousness of the oppressed group. And when we're talking about disability rights and access, it's such a widely diverse group that what people need to sort of fully participate in the world is really different from person to person. And I think that's one of the challenges, I guess, that we're just up against with doing activism along ability disability.
Yeah, that's important. It's important to highlight. And I think, we're so readily to think about disability in the context of being incapable or unable, or again, something being wrong with someone. When we can say disabled, we can say, disabled in the context of society is disabling, right? It is disabling to exist in society. And we're existing in a mass disabling event right now. We're existing in a mass event that is interlinked to so many different types of trauma, right? And we continue to experience it. Liz, you have your hand up.
Since we had a little extra time, I just wanted to say thank you. You were one of the first thought leaders that I discovered in this space, and you were really my entryway into this world. And this program has been fascinating. And it's been especially powerful to see everything through both a historic lens and a race lens and a community lens. So I'm just very appreciative.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. Yeah, I remember when you had first reached out to me, and you were just like, I was like looking around all of this different stuff, and then you popped up, and then we had that conversation of like, isn't the algorithm interesting? The fact that it targets people, but it's good in some ways because we find each other. Yeah, I think that's so important. Thank you for saying that. And I'm sorry, I forgot how your name is pronounced, so I'm going to just call on you. Yes.
It's Siobhan.
Siobhan, okay.
Yeah. Oh, hang on, I just popped that there. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to when you were talking about the whole sort of recovery movement, because I actually work at Recovery College here, and I started work about 2 years ago, and it was just, I just immediately brought in loads of courses on capitalism, inequality, and mental health, and the sort of loads of things like that. And it just, again, there's two different things that go on, and it's been quite difficult for me working there, because I think, like Liz put a comment in the chat about this, using the terminology of brainwashing, which seems, because I've been considered the problem person by coming in and doing what people think is what people don't want, or it's disruptive, or it's re-traumatizing, or it's rather than, there's so much sort of health education based courses that again sort of puts the responsibility back to the individual, and I think also it seems to be that that's such a, I suppose in terms of brainwashing, it gets repeated so much within our culture, and then that gets reinforced within those institutions. But then I try to even explain, look, the recovery movement came out of people sort of challenging psychiatric systems, and then you just co-opt. So I suppose actually my point is, for so many people, the way in which language is co-opted to give the impression of something radical happening, and then they start just spouting these words off, and it gives the impression of something happening, which actually makes me articulating that it isn't happening even more harder to have that conversation, because it's as if people don't pick. Yeah, it's the level of the co-optation, it's the way in which language is then used to make something appear that's happening, and then how that complicates me trying to explain, no, it's not happening, because they think that it is, because they're using the language. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of almost like, was it double think, or it can get really muddy when you're trying to push for change. That was my point. Yeah.
It can become exceptionally muddy. Yeah, I think the term recovery really came from the idea that people with mental health diagnoses do not recover, right? But rather that they needed to be rehabilitated, brought into these spaces, right? That there wasn't any self-determination around these ideas. And people saw that recovery movement, and they used the idea of recovery, right, as a tool for liberation. And what ended up happening was that same tool was used right back at us. It put the responsibility of that all back on us. If you follow the history of the psychiatric survivor movement, the MAD movement, it's really interesting. You see this rise around the 60s and 70s. Right around the rise of anti-war movements and all of these different movements, right? You have a lot of these things emerging from the civil rights movement. And then what ends up happening is that you have the Nixon administration, which very outwardly associates substances like marijuana and with the hippies and black folk, as well as cocaine. And you have this racialized, this war on race, right, that emerges to silence the initial civil rights movement that led to the inception of these other movements. And you have this very outward claim from the Nixon administration, and you can find it. I think his name is John Eldridge. He's someone from Nixon's administration, and he says, in quotes, right, that by associating marijuana and cocaine with the blacks and the hippies, right, we can separate their movements. We can really put them into a corner in terms of control. And what's interesting is that, around that time, 1972, right, throughout the 80s into the early 90s, you have the psychiatric survivor movement trying to chug along, right, and do a lot of this work. But then an immediate buyout starts happening. NIMH starts to buy out a lot of these groups and turn them into nonprofit organizations, which actually led to the formalization of peer support in the mental health system. What's interesting about that is that it's a lot of peer support spaces share a lot of these ideas to liberate our minds and us from a lot of these carceral ideologies, right? But what's interesting is that it was the formalization of consumers, which that was the initial term that was used, that really led to silencing our movements too.
Yes, I think that word consumers, because it just that's appealing. It does something very different. Yeah, you're right there. So that the whole language thing, yes, we have to be very specific. And I do like that, with the mad activism, that kind of is something that hopefully doesn't kind of end up falling and co-opted in the same way.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Anything that sells.
That there's always a risk of movements being co-opted and language being co-opted. That is just the truth of human innovation, change, a lot of things. But what is always true is that really getting to the root of the concept. Is it focusing on people's self-determination? Is it focusing on autonomy? Is it focusing on a lot of these things? And is it truthfully so? Is it being led by persons impacted? Are they just being consulted, right? Are they just being added to that conversation? And yes, capitalism. Capitalism is a big part of this. There's a constant driving force to be productive. And that if you're not productive, you're not valuable. And your inherent value is being tied to productivity. And that is inherently tied to disabling, how disabling society is. That is inherently tied to how clear your mind is, how well you are mentally, right? There are all of these things that are tied to that idea, right, of productivity, staying in constant productivity instead of my value is inherent. It isn't contingent on my productivity. And I do want to say, in terms of the UK, also going back, there's a great organization that talks about, it's called Recovery in the Bin. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but I did a conversation with them at the University of Sheffield on capitalism and mental health, specifically neoliberalism and mental health. And we were talking about it in the context of how does a capitalist society cause emotional distress or lead to emotional distress? Like, where does that really come from? How are those things interconnected? And there's a lot to that, right? And there's a lot. There's a lot of other tools of social control that marginalize people further. I'll use one example, which I always find fascinating. I always share in different spaces, and it's there are industrial therapists or industrial psychologists that work in industry, right? And they do different pieces of work, and they supervise other psychologists who teach mindfulness, right? And I can go on mindfulness and what's happened with mindfulness, but right now I'm going to talk about mindfulness as a tool for social control. So they go into they teach mindfulness to people who live in apartment buildings in areas that are being gentrified, right? And then they say things like, you don't need your home. You can live anywhere. You can really embrace these positive ideas. You can do this, you can do that. And those psychologists end up encouraging people, primarily Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color, to leave their homes and to be complacent in these ways. And that's just an example of how therapy can be used as a tool for social control as well. Because I know I've talked a lot about psychiatry, but there's, and again, the knowledge can be available. A lot of these pieces of knowledge that I'm sharing can be there. It's about how they are used. It's about how they are applied to systems. It is about true informed consent in our society.
Yes, absolutely. Don't get me started on mindfulness. A whole other. I think reminds me. There's a woman called Barbara. I think it's Barbara Wright. She wrote a book, Smile or Die, that went along a similar sort of thing about, this kind of like, hey, doesn't matter, we're downsizing the company, but this is a great opportunity. It's just such a manipulation of people's everything. I mean, that would tip me over the edge. Well, it has done on many occasions. It's it's like cultural mass gaslighting. that sort of, yeah.
Yeah, it's so important. So important. And again, if I can just drive the point home that along with digital and technological innovation comes new form of oppression. I was talking about that earlier, but there are things that are harmful that are erupting, particularly from that thing I was talking about earlier, digital phenotyping, as it applies to mental health. And really what I'm getting at is the fact that a diagnosis could be composed based on how I interact with my phone, based on the level of brightness, based on, that is a very huge level of surveillance. And again, that Abilify My site passing for FDA approval, there's so much there, and we will face new situations and new forms of oppression that we will then have to speak to in complete new ways that we just don't fully understand yet. And I think I'm tying that to therapy as a tool for social control because of the fact that if you don't understand the therapeutic practices, if you're not fully informed, once again, right, you don't know what you're agreeing to. Just see this therapist for a bit. We're trying to help everyone in their apartments, feel better about a lot of the stress that they're experiencing, so we can come to an understanding. It's presented in that way. And before you know it, you surrender your home, you surrender your space, you surrender your place of work, like you just highlighted. There's so much there in terms of social control and how it is adapting in the digital age and in general.
There's a great, I was going to find the link. There's a great Rabbi Twersky talking about, he read this article about lobsters and, lobster, hard shell, and the lobster has anxiety and feels like something bad's going to happen. And so it digs itself a hole to keep itself safe. And that's when it sheds its shell and grows the new shell. And he used that story to talk about, like, if psychiatry had their way, those lobsters would stay really small, because at the first sign of anxiety, we would make them feel better. We'd give them medication, and then they'd never grow. And I think several people have kind of made that point, that when we just kind of placate people and lock them up and dismiss them, that is hugely powerful way of controlling people.
Yeah, we have to examine social control in our society. And whenever you're thinking about how does systemic change actually apply, it starts with us. It really does. It starts with a self-examination, right? Really thinking about our own experiences, examining all of that carceral stuff, right? And then sharing that, right, socially, right, with other people. And then really, it's the influence of society that influences institutions, that influences the interpersonal, that influences how we view ourselves, and so on and so forth. It is an interconnected cycle that can exist if you want to tangibly apply anti-oppression to any social justice space. It starts with social awareness. It starts by having conversations like these.
Anyone else want to say anything before we got 6 minutes, but we do have that hard stop at 2. And Vesper, I know you have not been feeling well. It did not show. You knocked it out amazing as usual. If you were at all not at your top of, then wow, your top is pretty impressive, because I thought it was great. And so grateful. It really is not lost on me how rare conversations like this are, where people are not talking about this stuff, and we need to. So I'm just so grateful how much you're getting out there, saying this stuff, not afraid to talk about it, not afraid to challenge power systems. It's exactly what's needed right now. So I'm so grateful to know you and have working together, hopefully, to look forward to. We are hoping to bring a lot more trauma recovery training to people in their spaces, as a counter to going into sort of psychiatric settings to get help. Help and support should be available where we are. We shouldn't have to accept a stigmatized identity to get help and have community. So I'm so grateful that your thought leadership has really brought us to this place.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Always happy to have these conversations, and I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. I'm always happy to have these conversations. On my website, you'll see my email. You can also contact me through Kiva Centers, kivacenters.org.
I put your website. Eddie, I don't know if you want to say something you didn't get to say. We still have a few minutes.
Yeah, I know. I was on for the first half hour and then I had to go jump on to another meeting, and I came back, and I really appreciate this workshop, this time that you're on. But I'm someone that was formerly incarcerated, and I feel like a lot of our cities and towns and states we don't do very well with mental health. And it seems like there's not as many beds as before, but those people that need those beds that should be treated are in jail. And I feel like we transferred that, let the jail system take care of them. And I've seen so many people that should not be in jail that have legit like diagnoses, but instead they choose to like keep them medicated, keep them placated, like zombies in there. And it was just terrible to see, and a lot of them, like a lot of people have substance use disorder, but they also have mental health issues. And it seems like they only treat them for the substance use, but they don't get to the root of it. And then they just recidivism happens. They just go out and in and out. And it's terrible. But I just wanted to recognize that. I don't know if you guys talked about it or not, but how our jails are ending up having to take care of all our people with mental health issues. And it's a form of oppression as well.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. Systemic racism is where I'll start with that. Really, because there's a lot of Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color who are going to Department of Corrections facilities like prisons who want equitable access to mental health care, and yet they haven't interacted with the mental health system. So they're like, I just want access to therapy. I want a psychiatric hospital bed. I want this, I want that. And then there are white psychiatric survivors that might be like, why would you want that? The mental health system's terrible. Like, what are you doing? And there's this really, really difficult circumstance, right? Of people being like, I want access to these services. Why would you want to access this and that? And what it really comes down to is a very, very complicated multi-system issue, right? When it comes to prison abolition efforts, I'm still tying psychiatric abolition into that because the psychiatric institution is a prison under a different name. And I think something that's so important to what you're mentioning too is that at an astronomical number, if we do, as Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color, if we have an interaction with the mental health system, it's normally involuntary, right? It's normally involuntary commitment. It's normally this. It's not voluntary, or rather, even like I know earlier I was talking about questioning the very concept of voluntary, but it doesn't talk about informed consent. It's not that it's not this full understanding. So we really need to re-examine in terms of access as it relates to systemic racism. And having alternatives that really shouldn't even be alternatives. They should be in the mainstream, widely available and understood.
Agree. We definitely a good TTT topic, right? Trauma of incarceration, huge one. It's on the radar to address because it is huge. And thank you for calling our attention to it. We do have to end. Just one more round of love and gratitude for people being here, having the hard conversations, managing them so beautifully. And just, again, willingness to talk about trauma is amazing to me. It's awesome. So we just really appreciate everyone for being here. And hopefully we'll be seeing you soon in community. Thank you so much, Vesper.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.